Metal Gear Solid for the original PlayStation needs no introduction. It is one of the best and most memorable games for the Sony PlayStation, and a game that sold very well and received critical acclaim. You could make the argument that it is one of the best reinventions of a video game series of all time. However, despite the fanfare for 1998's Metal Gear Solid on the PlayStation, the 2000 Game Boy Color release of Metal Gear Solid is nowhere near as well known, and that is the title we are looking at today as we chat with HQ on our codec, while also puffing away on Snake's favorite brand. Thanks for sneaking behind enemy lines with us today as we look at this more obscure entry in the epic Metal Gear Solid series. Be sure to let us know what you feel is the best Metal Gear game in the comments section down below. Before we join Snake on his Game Boy Color mission, we need to look at where this iconic series started, and that was back in 1987 on the MSX computer. The original Metal Gear game was brought to us by Konami and was the brainchild of Hideo Kojima, and it would be the first game that he would design. A very impressive feat, considering that before this, his only known credit while working for Konami was their 1986 game Penguin Adventure, which was also released for the MSX. While a popular home computer in Japan, the MSX would also be released in other regions and was fairly successful in parts of Europe. Metal Gear, without any input from Hideo Kojima, would be ported to the NES, but this version makes some pretty major changes to the story, something that Kojima is not a huge fan of. The NES Metal Gear would be released in the USA in 1987 and would make its way to European regions between 1988 and 1989. Despite the changes, Metal Gear was a success on the NES, so much so that Konami wanted a sequel, and that brought us Snake's Revenge, a sequel that, like the NES version of Metal Gear, Hideo Kojima had nothing to do with. However, Kojima would get to make a sequel as he was the lead designer behind the MSX title Metal Gear Solid 2: Solid Snake. Interestingly, both Snake's Revenge and Metal Gear Solid 2 would be released in the same year, 1990. Konami and Kojima would be busy during the 90s. The Metal Gear series lay dormant for the better part of a decade. But then in 1998, thanks to the power of the PlayStation, Hideo Kojima was able to fully realize the creative and cinematic dream that he had with the original Metal Gear all those years ago with Metal Gear Solid. Regarded as one of the best games on the PlayStation, it was a fantastic stealth game that had action, a great story, interesting characters, and it set the tone for what the series would be for the decades that would follow. 1998 was a massive year in the world of gaming. It is often regarded as one of the biggest and best years in video game history. In addition to the masterpiece that is Metal Gear Solid, many other iconic and important titles would release. The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, Crash Bandicoot 3, Resident Evil 2, Panzer Dragoon Saga, Marvel vs. Capcom, StarCraft, Spyro the Dragon, Fallout 2, and many more huge games were released in 1998. Also in 1998, Sega would release the first of the next generation of video game consoles in Japan, the Sega Dreamcast, which gave us the likes of Sonic Adventure and Soul Calibur. Plus, 1998 is an important year for the game that we're talking about today, as it was in this year that Nintendo would release the Game Boy Color. During the 90s, it was not uncommon for there to be a console game and then a version of that same game for the Nintendo Game Boy. Some games would be very close. This was especially true during the NES days. For example, DuckTales by Capcom is pretty much the same in the Game Boy and the NES. However, Konami would usually do something different for their handheld offerings. Konami would make Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Castlevania games for the Game Boy, but they were not just ports of what the NES had to offer. Konami would instead make sure that the Game Boy had their own games that stood on their own. When you think about it, it is very impressive that they went this route instead of just making watered-down versions of what the Super Nintendo or the NES had to offer. They probably could have ported the NES version of Castlevania to the Game Boy, but instead they gave us Castlevania Adventure, a unique title for the handheld system. By the time we got to the new millennium, Metal Gear Solid had been selling consistently well since its release in 1998. There was Metal Gear Solid VR Missions released in 1999, and there was also a PlayStation Greatest Hits re-release of Metal Gear Solid. Konami of Europe felt that a Game Boy Color version of Metal Gear Solid would be a huge hit for them. The story is that Konami of Europe talked Konami in Japan into making Metal Gear Solid for the Game Boy Color, but like they did with their other games, Konami was not interested in just making a port of the console game, which would have been hard to do given the 3D gameplay and cinematic nature of Metal Gear Solid. The Game Boy Color in no way could replicate that same experience. It would not be Hideo Kojima leading the charge of this handheld entry in the series. The lead designer here would be Shinta Nojiri. Nojiri clearly handled the series in the right way, as he would be brought on to work on Metal Gear Solid 2 Sons of Liberty, Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater, and he would be the lead designer of the portable games Metal Gear Acid and Metal Gear Acid 2 for the PlayStation Portable. So, if a watered-down port of the PlayStation Metal Gear Solid was not something that Konami was interested in, what would Shinta Nojiri do? Well, he decided to make a sequel, but not a sequel to the PlayStation Metal Gear Solid. This is a sequel to the first Metal Gear Solid game for the MSX, ignoring the events of Metal Gear Solid 2 Snake's Revenge and the NES game Snake's Revenge. The title of this new entry in the series would be Metal Gear Ghost Babel. Well, in Japan, that was the case. For some reason, many people consider this to be why the game is not quite as well known as that iconic PlayStation title. Konami decided to ditch the Ghost Babel subtitle and instead call the game simply Metal Gear Solid in the West. This led to some confusion as, understandably, some people thought that they were getting a port of the PlayStation game due to the portable title having the same name. These days, many people refer to the Western version of the Game Boy Color game as Metal Gear Solid 2000. Despite being a portable game, Metal Gear Solid for the Game Boy Color is a cinematic, story-driven game, much like its console namesake was, but it does it in an 8-bit Game Boy Color style. Set several years after the original MSX Metal Gear game, Snake has been retired and living in Alaska, but he is called back into action. Set in Central Africa, there's a civil war going on in the Gindra region. The Gindra Liberation Front, or the GLF, is what they are more commonly referred to in the game, has managed to get their hands on a new Metal Gear prototype, and their plans are to use this to swing things in their favor. This is not all the GLF has up its sleeves. They also have a collection of mercenaries who were once members of a special forces unit called Black Chamber. These are some very cool characters, and they have that perfect blend of Metal Gear coolness and cheesiness that fans of the series love. You have Black Arts Viper, who is the leader of the group. They are a specialist when it comes to traps, and they have a Winter Soldier-style prosthetic arm. Slasher Hawk has a hawk along with 2 boomerangs, which is a fitting weapon as he is from Australia. Marionette Owl is a pretty dark character as they were a serial killer before joining the group, and now he uses these creepy Japanese-style puppets as weapons. Last, but by no means least, we have Pyro Bison. As their name suggests, they are a master of fire and have a specially designed flamethrower as a weapon. Snake needs to infiltrate their base, take down the mercenaries, and put a stop to the Metal Gear. This is a very story-driven game, and like the PlayStation game, the codec is used for much of the story, and it is done superbly well. The characters are all a lot of fun and have that Metal Gear charm to them, even without Kojima being the creative force behind the story. While the story of the game is very entertaining, it is not classed as canon to the Metal Gear series, which is a bit of a shame as a ton of time, effort, and love was clearly poured to this thrilling tale. One other thing that is interesting about the story is that the American Video Game Ratings Board, the ESRB, gave the game an E for Everybody rating. The fact that the story in this game has a former serial killer as one of the characters, there are many deaths and murders, and there is even talk of very heavy themes such as genocide, makes you wonder just how much of the story the ESRB experienced for them to say that this was a story that was suitable for gamers of all ages. It is a very mature story, arguably one of the most mature that the Game Boy Color has to offer. Yet despite having this very mature story, it does still have a bit of that classic Nintendo censorship, and instead of using his cigarettes, Snake has some kind of vapor machine to reveal hidden lasers. In addition to having a great story, Metal Gear Solid for the Game Boy Color is a very well-designed game as far as the presentation goes. They have gone for a style that is very similar to the original Metal Gear game on the MSX. You have a top-down view with sprite-based characters and stages. However, things are slightly more detailed here. For example, you can actually see enemies turning their heads to the side, which does help with the stealth gameplay. The animation for such small sprites is nice and smooth, and the various locations in the game all feel very fitting for a game that bears the Metal Gear Solid name. While, as expected, there is no voice acting in the game, the sound design is still impressive. The game has a fantastic soundtrack that fits the tone of the story and the gameplay very well. Plus, we already touched on the codec being part of the game, but it is as close to the way that it looked on the PlayStation as they possibly could have gotten with the more modest hardware that the Game Boy Color offered them. Sure, Metal Gear Solid for the Game Boy Color is a good-looking game with a fantastic story, but what about the gameplay? Much like the visuals, Shinta Nojiri looked to the original Metal Gear game for inspiration. The game is played from the top-down perspective, and you are tasked with sneaking around, avoiding enemies, taking out enemies, and completing your missions. Those original Metal Gear games were a bit more rigid in the way that Snake controlled, as he could only move in 4 directions. Here, Snake feels more nimble as he can move diagonally. One of the things that makes this game stand out from the rest is the more stage-based gameplay. There are 13 separate stages in the game, and after each one you will get a mission ranking. For a portable title, this was a rather clever way to make the game more suitable for not being played for several hours at once, like a console game. With the Game Boy Color only having 2 main buttons, you would think that the gameplay would be rather limited, but this is not the case. You have 1 main button, and then your second button is used for whatever weapon or gadget Snake is holding at that time. The stealth-based gameplay is fun as Snake can lie on the ground, lie flat against the wall, and you can even move the camera slightly ahead to get a peek at what is waiting for you. One way that the Game Boy Color shows that it had more power than the MSX is with the scrolling. Even the NES version of that first Metal Gear game had Snake move from one screen to the next. For the most part here, each stage that you are on will have the screen scroll with Snake, rather than switching to a new one when he walks off screen. Snake controls really well, and like the PlayStation game, sneaking around trying to avoid getting into fights with enemies is doable here. However, like that PlayStation game, it is not uncommon for Snake to have to open fire or dish out some justice with his fists when you get a little too eager and run into a room you did not check out first. Metal Gear Solid plays very well, but it is not a perfect game. There are a couple of sections that are known to be frustrating. The most common one people will bring up is the box puzzle, where Snake has to use different colored boxes on a conveyor belt to progress. Many fans of this game will straight up tell a new player to grab a guide for this section, as it can be very tedious to deal with. There is another puzzle with a hidden door that no doubt had some players tearing their hair out. At the end of the day, Metal Gear Solid for the Game Boy Color is a portable game, so you're not going to be getting a 10 to 20 hour experience like you would on a console. However, there is a solid 5 to 7 hours of espionage and action, depending on how skilled you are at these types of games. Konami could have just had the main story and called it a day, and people would probably still regard Metal Gear Solid as one of the best Game Boy Color games. Yet Konami truly went above and beyond with this release, as there is a ton of extra content for you to have some fun with. Once you have beaten the game, you can replay the stages in any order you want to try to get a higher ranking for them. There will be new objectives for you to complete, including fighting hidden items. An interesting twist here is that when you replay these stages, you are not doing so as Snake, but as an agent who is reliving these events as part of a VR mission. This is fun, but they add extra story here as there is a mysterious character referred to as Number 4 who gives you extra bits of information about what Snake went through during the missions. There are also a whole bunch of extra VR missions for you to complete as well. There are actually 180 VR missions, and they come in 3 different styles: Weapon, Sneaking, and Advanced, and then each of the mission styles will have various sub-missions inside of them. There is certainly a lot to keep you busy here after you have beaten the game. Fans of the PlayStation game will no doubt get a kick out of some of these VR missions, as they are top-down versions of some of the ones that they played on PlayStation. Another extra that was included is part of the codec. Idea Spy 2.5 is a fun story that was written by Shuyo Murata, and once you have beaten the game, when you replay the levels, if you tune the codec to 140.07, you will get a new chapter of this engaging story. This is a lot of fun, and Kojima himself was such a fan of it that many years later, in 2006, he actually turned this into a full radio drama, and he voiced the main role with Shinta Nojiri himself voicing one of the bosses, which is just so much fun. While the inclusion of Idea Spy 2.5 is a fantastic bit of extra content, in a very bizarre decision, Konami decided to cut this from the American release of the game. What makes this even stranger is that this is not a case of it being only included with the Japanese version of Metal Gear Ghost Babel. In Europe, including the UK, they would get Idea Spy 2.5 in their version of the game, so it was already translated into English. No reason has ever been given as to why this was cut from the American release of the game, but it does mean that some die-hard Metal Gear Solid fans want the European version in their collections, as that is the complete version. Even if you take into account that the American version of the game is missing Idea Spy 2.5, it is beyond impressive just how much content this game has to offer. While it may not have been a port of the PlayStation game, there is no way that anyone who had a Game Boy Color and got this game would have been disappointed with the massive amount of content that it offered. Were you aware that in Europe and Japan they got an extra piece of content in the game? Let us know in the comments section down below. No matter if you want to call it Metal Gear Solid for Game Boy Color, Metal Gear Ghost Babel, or even Metal Gear Solid 2000, this is a very special game. The Game Boy Color has some fantastic games, and it is very unusual to see a top 10 list of Game Boy Color games that does not include this excellent title. Given the limitations of the hardware that they were working with, it is hard to imagine what Konami could have done to make this better. At the time it was released, Metal Gear Solid for the Game Boy Color was well received, but it never reached the heights that the PlayStation game did. Part of this was possibly down to the fact that they called it the same name as the PlayStation title. However, 2000 was a very interesting year in gaming. In 2000, the PlayStation 2 was going to be released with a brand new main entry in the Metal Gear Solid series, coming in 2001 in Metal Gear Solid 2: Sons of Liberty. Plus, Nintendo would release the Game Boy Advance around a year after Metal Gear Solid on the Game Boy Color, meaning many people were busy looking at the new games for that system rather than what came out for the Game Boy Color the year prior. It kind of makes you wonder, if Konami had perhaps held back this game and instead made it for the Game Boy Advance, and it was released somewhere in that launch window, if it would have been an even bigger hit. Not only has the Game Boy Color version of Metal Gear Solid become something many gamers feel is one of the best games that the system has to offer, it has become a real collector's item as well. You could even go as far as to say it is a grail item for many gamers. This commands a very high price on the secondary market. As of making this video, Price Charting has a complete copy of this game listed at close to $375. A new inbox version will cost you the better part of $900, and graded versions of the game have been known to go for over $1,000. Even the loose cartridge is going for $150, with the manual alone being worth close to $90. This is a very expensive and collectible game that many people want to own. It is one of those rare games that is rare due to how limited and popular it is, but it is also a fantastic and entertaining game as well. So many Grail games are not actually fun to play, but that is certainly not the case here. Not only is the high price of this a downside to those who want to own it, when it comes to the Game Boy Color, outside of the Pokemon games, it is a toss-up between Metal Gear Solid and Resident Evil Gaiden in regards to which game has the most bootleg copies out there. This does mean that if you want to have a real copy of the game in your collection, you probably want to open it up and make sure that it is legit. On the other side of this, for those who do wish to add Metal Gear Solid to their collection, but they don't care if it's a legit copy, you can get a bootleg, or repro if you prefer that term, for under $10 for just the cartridge, and you can even get a repro box as well. If you are lucky enough to have a copy of Metal Gear Solid in your collection, we would love to read the story about how you got it, especially if you managed to get it for a great price. In addition to the game being fantastic, another reason as to why Metal Gear Solid for the Game Boy Color commands such a high price is that this game has never been re-released since its initial release all the way back in 2000. While they are not cheap, there are many copies of the PlayStation and PlayStation 2 Metal Gear Solid games out there, as they were released as part of the PlayStation Hits or PlayStation Platinum series. With Metal Gear Solid on the Game Boy Color, it got that release, and then that was it. In 2023, Konami released the amazing Metal Gear Solid Master Collection for PlayStation, Xbox, PC, and Nintendo Switch. This is an absolutely amazing collection of 8 Metal Gear games, including the original MSX and NES titles. However, Metal Gear Solid for the Game Boy Color is notable in its absence. While this was frustrating at the time, Metal Gear Solid for the Game Boy Color was not the only Metal Gear title missing from that collection. Other notable absentees include the also Shinta Nojiri-directed PlayStation Portable Metal Gear games, along with the Nintendo GameCube remake of the PlayStation original, titled Metal Gear Solid: The Twin Snakes. While it has not been confirmed at the recording of this video, it has been widely speculated that Konami is working on a Metal Gear Solid Master Collection 2, which very well could feature the Game Boy Color version of Metal Gear Solid, and finally, those who missed out can see why those who played this game hold it in such high regard. We want to thank you for joining us today, and we would love to know what your thoughts on Metal Gear Solid for the Game Boy Color are in the comments section down below.